Thank you, Ellen. Yes. So, as I said, I'll speak for 5 to 8 minutes, then the panelists will. When you have a question from the audience, please pick up one of the local microphones that are near you. And we ask the panelists, also, you're going to be doing your own introductions, I'm sorry, but just tell us a little bit about you before you speak. And then, and repeat the question when the questioners have it. So a little bit about myself. I'm a theologian at the Greek Orthodox Seminary in Boston. I was friends with Jane Jacobs, you know. I knew Jane Jacobs, I was friends with Jane Jacobs, and I'm no Jane Jacobs, in the words of a certain vice presidential debate years ago. So there she is. That's a very nice person. Whom we all know and love. I got to meet her because I wrote her a letter in 2000 in which I said that she seemed to be describing cities as if they could meaningfully and really be described as vast public liturgies, by which I meant, first of all, that they make use of time as a raw material. That's because they're alive, but they go through cycles of death and life. They go through other aspects of their existence. They rely upon a certain level of participation. The whole catastrophe of what happens as people work together in a city unconsciously, the emergent order of the liturgy of hours, that a neighborhood staying busy at different times around the clock, keep it safe. Let me step over here so I can see my panel itself. And in fact, I want to come over to this side because I'm not wearing my glasses. So for how can cities be a liturgy unless people can participate, have access to home equity loans, access to working capital, enjoy public safety, etc. All of these things are kind of known. But cities are created by everybody and for everybody. It just so happened that when Jane Jacobs wrote To the Death and Life of Great American Cities, Warren Weaver was issuing his valedictory address, and he was an important scientific figure the 25 years prior, and he wrote his summary of the history of science, that science could be summarized as an era in which we first discovered how to do problems in simplicity. I think I'm blocking people's views, so I'm going to go further back. Or two variable problems, then problems in disorganized complexity in the early 20th century, the other extreme. And finally, he said, from 1932 on, we became able to handle problems in organized complexity where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And his great hope, and Jane Jacobs' great hope, was that this new kind of science would be explicitly, consciously, widely, intentionally adopted by anyone studying a living or complex system. I don't know that that's happened, but that was the hope. What I've noticed is that information varies predictably across the three kinds of science, that in this early science and simplicity, we're looking for information that is highly potent, ideally low in quantity, and the quality is really an indifferent consideration. With problems in disorganized complexity, information is low in potency, ideally infinite in quantity. Again, not necessarily high in quality, we're just looking for the big picture. Whereas with living systems, biological systems like the city or an economy, we're looking for information that has a middling potency, a mid-range in quantity, but very high in quality. And as a philosopher and ethicist, it seems to me that what we're looking at is sciences, one that corresponds to the pursuit of the good or the effective, one that corresponds to the true, the broadest perspective, and one that is our science of beauty. The beauty in the sense of looking to health. For Jacobs, beauty is not to be had for the asking. She wasn't concerned so much with the visual look of things, but she thought that the neighborhood should be beautiful in the sense of healthy, and that the people responsible for it would know that it is a problem in organized complexity and not use the other two kinds of sciences inappropriately. We all know chapter 22 and the three tactics for studying organically complex systems. The first three she lists, the other three she just demonstrates. You've got to understand an organic system, you have to love it. You have to take time. Complex systems are shy somehow. And you probably need a mentor. For Jacobs, human beings are not the problem. If you're looking for beauty in the Jacobs vision, it's people themselves, more than, say, the look of a construction. I have, in my recent work, moved beyond this, the city as liturgy thesis. I'm looking more at what I call a beauty-first model of pastoral care or ethical, psychological care. A big part of designing an organically complex town is accepting that feeling too lies along the continuum of cognition. What does the animal side of us say about a particular place? And for Jacobs, this dimension is implied by her belief that human beings are natural, a part of nature as much as anything else. Together we form an organically complex system, and evolution has produced us through billions of years of sensing, not thinking. So somehow our feelings are cognitive acts. So we know that in the post-war phase, in our design, we use pretty much only the first two kinds of science. We've lost that softness and that wholeness and the feel of things. But if we're looking for beauty in a city neighborhood, it has to start with the aesthetic and physical, that level of coherence, safety, overall health. Then hopefully that we understand that it's a complex system and that it actually is a well-functioning one. And then finally, something on the more information theoretic level. That information appears densely. In a beautiful neighborhood, we not only experience dense information densely and at fractal scale, but we become information. We are neither bored nor harassed, the two non-informational extremes of chaos or sameness. Just to wrap up my 5 minutes of fame, the First Amendment says that the right of the people peaceably to assemble, shall not be infringed. But I think a lot of us are here because we have the sense that somehow our design principles make truly peaceable assembly impossible. No one can kind of feel sort of comfortable in their own skin in the way we've designed the built environment as you move through it. How does beauty forge peace in cities? There's a loving couple in Paris. That's what I Googled for that image. And to summarize, in a healthy city, someone has to voluntarily suffer or work for this place. Everyone has to have some kind of skin in the game. Everyone has to contribute to this public thing called the city. I guess the final thing I would say is that for Jacobs, it's true, yes, that we're part of nature. Did I go over my 8 minutes, or did this thing not even go off? Oh, sorry. It's true that we're, I don't know how long I was. It's true that we're natural for her, except she would also say that to be truly natural, we must be virtuous and we must be rational. And that the task of fitting in with nature requires us to learn the ins and outs of how to deal with complex systems and how to function within them. Thank you. Okay, so would one of my panelists like to go, our panelists like to go first, or does anyone have Alain?
Thank you. So my name is Alain Berthaud. I studied architecture at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris many years ago. My first job was with Le Corbusier in Chandigarh. I was a glorified draftsman, frankly. I didn't design Chandigarh, I was just tracing. To make my life resume short, 5 years ago, I wrote a book called Order Without Design. And I was 79 years old. My children say that I was a late bloomer, they knew it. So I've been mostly working in urban planning all over the world. And my comments on J. Jacobs is to remind also one quotation of her: cities cannot be a work of art. Cities are never finished, and although we look for beauties in cities, but the entire city is not a sculpture. I'm alluding here some very successful architects recently who are trying to design entire neighborhood as a sculpture. And this is a terrible thing. You can design one building if you want on a lot as a sculpture if you like it, and let's see if the other people like it. But to design an entire neighborhood, for instance, I'm talking here about a neighborhood in Turkey, a very large, it's several square kilometers, designed by Sarah Hadid as an enormous sculpture. I think it's a terrible mistake. Anything which is a mega structure, I'm talking also about, I don't know if you remember, nobody's old enough to remember Paul Rudolph building this mega structure across Manhattan. This is a terrible thing. Why? Precisely because cities are about people. As soon as you build a mega structure, this mega structure cannot possibly evolve. It's a dead thing, where in fact a city evolves more through a Darwinian process, by making mistake, by the way, like a Darwinian process, small variation, and then the public select among those variations the one they prefer. So it's not so much to test your potential client to know the demand, but rather to have your own ideas, propose them, and some of them will fail, so what? The important thing is that some of them will be copied, the ones that are successful are copied. So a city is certainly not, among my colleagues sometimes I have the feeling that they think that city can be designed like a smartphone. A smartphone is a wonderful thing, but after 4 or 5 years, it's obsolete and you throw it away. A city cannot be thrown away. And so that's, let's say, my conclusion is that again, we have to think back at a city as a Darwinian process, and I think that's what Jane Jacobs was talking about, that we have to relate cities to people, and if we build infrastructure or anything, it's to serve people. Very often, people design infrastructure and say, for my infrastructure to be financially viable, this is the density I have here, or this is the way jobs should be distributed. I think it's wrong. I think we have to look at the way jobs are distributed and people are distributed, and then develop an infrastructure for that. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name's Ellen Dunham-Jones. I'm a professor at Georgia Tech in Atlanta, and I direct the Master of Science in Urban Design. I'm also trained as an architect, but at this point I am strictly working as an urbanist. I'm a longtime member of CNU, and I maintain the world's only database, no one else cares, that tracks what's happening to the dead malls, dead strip malls, dying office parks, all of the aging, automobile-oriented suburban property types that are getting old and underperforming. And I track those that have been either redeveloped into more walkable urban compact places, or re-inhabited with more community-serving uses, or re-greened because we never should have built there in the first place. And we have well over 2,000 examples in the database now. And I've written, my notes just went away. I've co-written 2 books with June Williamson on retrofitting suburbia. So I thought it's pretty easy. I'm going to talk a little about how retrofitting suburbia exemplifies Jane Jacobs' thoughts about organized complexity that Tim just shared with us. Now, she was writing, the book was published in 1961, Death and Life of Great American Cities. She was, it was a time of mass suburbanization, urban renewal. And she was really writing her critique about what she saw, that planners were oversimplifying cities but her critique could have just as equally applied to the oversimplification of suburbia. Segregated uses, segregated income groups, cookie-cutter houses and lot sizes, single modes of mobility, single presumed user groups, mostly white middle class, young families. We all kind of know the stereotypes of suburbia, and there's more. The suburbs were always more diverse than those stereotypes, but still, we know how it's evolved into sprawl. 40 years later, after her book, is when kind of, in the early 2000s, we began to see CNU and projects like ION begin urbanizing suburbs, and by organizing the complexity, adding diversity of all kinds, very much along the playbook of Jane Jacobs. So we start to see the mixed uses, the mixed incomes, more diverse building types, tenures, and lot sizes, multiple mobility modes, more diverse household sizes, but still largely white middle class. So, seeing this evolution, June Williamson and I wrote our first book because the suburban retrofits we thought were important, and they were actually happening, and yet these projects weren't getting published in the architecture magazines. The neo-traditionalism wasn't seen as avant-garde or cool enough to deserve publication. They were kind of under the radar. So we published the first book mostly focusing on, if you were doing anything to reduce automobile dependency on a dead suburban a site that had now gone dead in the suburbs, you got in the book. That's more or less what the bar was. However, we felt compelled to write a second book 10 years later because the number of retrofits was exploding, the projects were much better designed, but most important, and they were definitely getting to be more beautiful, but they were also much more ambitious. Now, communities were increasingly saying, well, while you reduce automobile dependence, what are you doing for climate change, for equity, for public health, for an aging society? Help us compete with jobs. So I feel on the one hand quite optimistic as I see more and more examples of regreened stormwater parks to adapt to climate change, suburban arterials going on road diets, reallocating space to transit, bikes, and pedestrians. Many more ADUs, missing middle housing, accommodating smaller households. Senior housing and retirement communities are increasingly being integrated into communities instead of, drive to out on the faraway lot. Programmed town greens to build social capital, to combat the epidemic of loneliness, and to provide healthy outdoor space. I wish I saw more efforts to combat the invasion of private equity investors converting swaths of formerly owner-occupied aging suburban houses into rentals. 30% of sales now are rapidly transforming the neighborhoods. And, what all of this kind of adds up to is seeing these now as communities are, I think, increasingly layering solutions to not to every single one of these challenges, but to multiple challenges that are relevant to their conditions. The best suburban retrofits are really organizing ever more complexity. It's just growing in the number of systems that are being challenged and the way that design solutions are doing that. And through that, they are increasing sustainability, equity, prosperity, and beauty. So the optimistic future vision is that eventually we'll get enough mixed-use town centers, enough regreenings and re-inhabited buildings to create a healthy polycentric region. I agree with Andres' comment this morning that climate change could actually be our friend in terms of promoting the re-greening of places that never should have been built on in the first place. But my provocation is, do I really believe that, will the new infrastructure bill be directed in ways that would help us achieve that healthy polycentric region? It could, but I don't think it will, unless we can really all do something about it. My big provocation that I want to kind of leave the group with is that we need to prepare for a majority-minority population. And I haven't heard nearly enough discussion about that. If you're under 18 in this country right now, whites are no longer a majority. It is a majority-minority. There's just a lot of different flavors. If you're under 35, by 2030, you will be living in a majority-minority population. And so I think we need to learn more lessons from black and brown suburbia. I would challenge everyone who's involved in changing the suburbs, changing cities. Read more Afrofuturism. Be inspired by authors who have very different futurist, utopian, and dystopian characterizations of the built environment than what we've been kind of used to. Pay even more attention to how organized complexity engages our human capacities and interests in terms of aesthetics. So that I want to see the complexity that Colin Rowe is a former professor at Cornell who wrote a lot about the ability of the mind to simultaneously perceive two images or multiple figures at the same time. And that's how its complex designs, whether that is through the nested hierarchies of a classical column and then the nested hierarchies similarly within its capital and within the individual fluting, I mean, these nested hierarchies, or whether it's through much more modern proportional systems and nested hierarchies and languages. In all these cases, Colin Rowe would argue, that's how we engage human perception, black, brown, white, yellow, whatever. We are wired to look at aesthetics, I think, actually very similarly, but to be engaged with them in terms of our human capacities is really, I think, where the beauty of complexity would lie.
Thank you very, very much, Ellen. Samuel, do you want to go next? Absolutely, absolutely.
I don't want to arrogate to myself. I pranced about to a certain extent. Yes. Now advanced warning. I'm terrible with these things. Moving around, and you'll get a mixture of. So I mean, I'll try not to do it, but I will do it, and it's going to be very irritating for everyone. Okay, right. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit about sort of what we've been up to recently in England, which, as you may have guessed, is where I come from. I am Samuel Hughes. I'm a research fellow at the University of Oxford. I also do a lot of policy work, so currently I'm the head of housing for the Centre for Policy Studies, which is a Westminster think tank. I've worked in the civil service and things beforehand. It's obviously a pleasure and an honor to be here in this beautiful place and in this gem among cities, which I had never been to before, and which I confess it was partly an ulterior motive of mine in coming over for. But so I was listening to Andres Rouhani earlier saying, you know, in America you've got this system, the suburban subdivision system, and this is like, it's a fearsome machine, like it's really efficient, it's well-oiled, the cogs are all turning and so forth, right? And it's really powerful. And I was thinking, wow, lucky Americans. Just imagine, they have a system which may produce bad stuff, but at least it sort of produces something. It kind of works. In England, right, the system is broken. It's already happened. And that as Andre said, actually, that is an interesting place to be in, because when the system's kind of failed on its own terms, people start getting a bit more creative about possibilities. And that's come up specifically with reference to the idea of beauty, which is what the particular focus of our panel. Government knows that we're producing far too few houses, and there's a very acute housing shortage. It knows that one reason why we're producing far too few houses, the main reason we're producing far too few houses, is that local people vigorously oppose having new homes built near them. And it knows that one reason why people oppose new homes being built near them is that they expect these new homes to be ugly. It's a perfectly reasonable thing for them to expect, because they usually are. So, interestingly, and that argument, that was made by some think tanks and so on in the 2010s, and that's kind of cut through. That is now part of received political wisdom in Britain. So in the 2010s, government set up this thing, the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, to kind of work out why are we building so many ugly places, and how could we stop doing that? And they asked Roger Scruton, who'll be known to some of you, to chair it, and later Nicholas Boyce-Smith of Create Streets works as co-chair. And I got into all this in the course, I was a research assistant on this commission, so I came to start knowing about this stuff. And I'm just mainly going to tell you about one idea. That commission produced a huge report with 50 recommendations or something. I'm just going to tell you about one idea from those recommendations, which I think is interesting, and which maybe with various changes could have some applicability also in an American context. Okay, bit of background, right? I'm going to give you this papier-mâché history of the English planning system. It won't be completely accurate, but it will be in outlines, be basically true. So up until the middle of the 20th century, a very, very simple development control system. Roughly, you can build whatever you like up to 80 foot plus 2 roof stories subject to fire regulations. In previous centuries, cities grow outwards quite slowly because they're constrained by everyone's need to walk everywhere or walk to most of the railway station. So as populations rise, you get better uses made of plots, people add more stories, they use up more of the plot area, and you gradually get this very fine urban fabric that anyone who knows London will know from Covent Garden and Soho and the City, know from the Edinburgh Old Town. No, of course, versions of this are true all across Europe. So this is what Nassim Taleb would call, it was a complex system, simple but highly sophisticated regulatory system that produced these very, very rich and successful results. 20th century, we move away from this for various reasons. In the post-war, in Britain, we had a system which basically the assumption was we will always be able to meet our housing needs by further outward expansion. So we don't really need the disruption that comes with intensifying existing urban areas. And in the post-war planning system, the specific assumption was the government, though this doesn't have a very easy parallel in the United States, the idea was the government was build these new towns to meet housing needs. So it would seize big tracts of the countryside, expel the population, and then master plan these sort of modernist cities. Then it did this in various cases. They were mostly extremely unpopular and very dysfunctional. So that kind of died out by the 1970s, and we were left with this system, which is really good at prohibiting development, but really bad at enabling it. A system which doesn't really have any mechanism for doing this. And you add to that the system of greenbelting that we have around English cities to stop their further outward expansion. A system which has many upsides to it, but if you don't have any other mechanism for producing homes, is going to exacerbate a housing shortage. So we've got this situation now in London, very interesting situation, where sales prices of homes are about 4 times higher than their build cost. And any of our, if you had the old system, the old pre-1947 system, any of our ancestors would have found this extremely bizarre, because under their system, what would have happened is London would have rapidly intensified. You could fit, I think if you built London up to sort of Marylebone densities, roughly the maximum densities that the old system allowed, which everyone finds very agreeable today, you could fit maybe 45 or 50 million people into the existing urban area of London, which currently has about 8 million people in it. So you could meet all the housing needs Britain will ever have in the centuries until its population eventually peaks. And so could all be met through intensifying just up to the levels of Marylebone, which everyone agrees to be a lovely and urbanistically flourishing neighborhood. Now, interesting situation we're in at the moment, on any given street, if any homeowner receives planning permission to go up to those kind of densities, the second they get that permission, they become probably an asset multi-millionaire in many cases. They've got a really strong interest in getting that permission. But everyone else on the street, they get building work going on next to them, and like loss of sight lines and amenity and changing the character of the neighborhood and pressure on local services and infrastructure and this kind of thing. So you have this interesting situation where you could have a street where it's in every individual's interest to get this permission, but it's also in everyone's interest to oppose that permission for everyone else. It's like a classic kind of collective action problem that they're stuck in. And that the current system doesn't really have any way around that. Intensification never happens, almost never happens in London. Our proposal that we had in the Building Better report is, could you have a system of street votes to get around this? So street by street, 2/3 votes for the right to go up to higher densities with a maximum of those kind of Georgian Victorian densities that you see in Marylebone. The people have got an extremely strong incentive in many areas to vote in favor of doing this, because the second they vote, the moment the vote passes, they all become rich. By doing it, they could produce a huge number of homes. And by doing it, I mean, they are basically opting back into the old pre-1947 planning system that produced the old cities of Europe. So in the long run, they could produce the kind of urbanism that many of us here dearly prize. That's the core idea. There's a lot of complexity, as like loads of people here no doubt will have questions about. I'm not going to talk about that now, but we can talk about it later. So there's a lot of interest in this in Britain now. The government now has announced it wants to do street votes, and there's draft legislation passing through Parliament at the moment. So we have this, like, a few weeks ago, we were pretty sure we would get this through. Now, I don't know how much you follow British politics, but it's like running up a steep and narrow path that is collapsing under your feet at the same time. Whether we can get this legislation through while there is still a government in this. But like, at the moment, there aren't any major groups that are opposing it. The opposition, Labour Party also seems sympathetic to street votes. So we're sort of quite optimistic that this might happen. And then we would like to serve as like a policy laboratory, given that we're in this country we have this crazy political system without proper checks and balances. We can like trial a crazy policy like street votes, and then if it fails, you don't have to worry about it. And if it succeeds, you might have something interesting to work with in the United States, and you can see what version of this might be adapted. So that's the idea. I wanted to also just to come back briefly and say something about beauty again, right? What's the significance of beauty here? There's a lot of things I could say about this. It was in fact my original interest in the whole subject. One thing I would say is that like ceaseless attention to beauty in this is not an optional extra to winning the argument. So there's been lots of people talking about intensification for quite a long time in Britain. They never made any progress at all. One reason for that was that they didn't look at like local democratic mechanisms. But another reason for that is they didn't pay attention to what's actually a beautiful place. What kind of place, what's a vision of this country or this city that people can identify with and want to see? I've got here that you will actually be able to see these. It's a quite crazy idea. But two of we have no traditional architecture sector in Britain. But fortunately, I once had a fellowship at Notre Dame University, so I have a big network among graduates of it. And lots of them have contributed renderings, before and after renderings, to us over time. And I just saw two of them yesterday, and they gave me the originals. So I'm just going to try and sort of lamely hold these up. There we go. I would like your assistance, actually. That would be extremely helpful. This wasn't a very well-planned part of the talk, but I thought, okay, so before and after. That would be before. You're the before.
You're the before.
Yeah, the ugly one, I'm afraid. Yes. So we've produced a lot like this, and I cannot tell you how powerful it is. Like, so many people, they hear the proposal first, and they're like, it sounds a bit weird, and then you show them that, and they go, oh, hang on. Yeah, well, I'd like a neighborhood like that. Yeah, the British newspapers love them because they can put them on their websites with these slider bars where you go from before and after. And millions of people have now seen the renderings that we've done like this. And you look at the comments below and they're all like, well, yeah, I mean, if it looked like that, that would be fine, but we don't trust us. So one thing, like, in terms of building an alliance, look very, very carefully for, like, what are precedents for good urban, I mean, I'm telling the American new urbanists this, you all know this already, but, like, look for precedents of, like, good urbanism that people identify with and already love, and then you can offer them a picture of transformation which is also a picture of restoration, like a picture of healing a place rather than a picture of like losing the place that they love, which is one of the things that people really are afraid of when it comes to intensification. The other thing, I think that's enough, yes, thank you very much. The other thing to say is like, that comes up in this context is you see, like, sometimes if you get the system right, beauty, it can be a means, as I'm doing here. It can also, interestingly, be a kind of a byproduct. So if you get, like, we in Britain have a deeply broken system. We'd all like to produce beautiful urbanism, and everyone's sort of trying to do this. And somehow we sort of, having junked the system originally that produced it, we actually can't work out how to do it. Like, we've sort of forgotten how to do this. The system must have been clever in some way, and but we don't know quite what it was. So it's a really interesting situation to be in. If you get the underlying economics right, and the underlying politics right, then you start generating people. I mean, the builders of the 18th and 19th centuries were not wonderful people like our hosts today. They were not deeply committed. Many of them were really villainous. Like, they did whatever they could to make as much money as possible on the but they did that in the scope of a regulatory system where, like, the way to make the most money as quickly as possible was to produce fantastic urbanism. So, beauty is a means to getting good urbanism, and ideally it should be also a byproduct of the right kind of rules that get that kind of urbanism. So totally central, like indispensable, cannot be left out of the discussion, has to be there at all times. Thank you very much.
Very good. I'll just stay over here. Is that okay? My name's Chuck Marone. I'm with Strong Towns. I'm a civil engineer, a land use planner, author, writer, musician, dad. I thought about the beauty of complexity a lot on the way out here because I was the diva who came late because I was catching many, many planes. And I recognize, particularly in the place that I live in a small town in the center of Minnesota. If you said, I prefer this development pattern over this development pattern because of its beauty, someone would inevitably stand up and say, well, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? Beauty is something that we bring to the table. It's not something intrinsic. And I've always found that to be wrong, just inherently wrong. In trying to explain why it's wrong, I came back to the idea of smell. That smells good, that smells bad. You can say, well, smell is in the eye of the beholder, right? And certainly we all have different preferences in terms of colognes or perfumes or what have you. But we all understand that, like, a rotting piece of meat smells bad, right? And a well-cooked piece of meat smells good. And we understand that intrinsically. There are people on the edges of that distribution that will say, oh, I like the smell of rotting meat. But those are the people who died, years ago, right? The reason we all react to the smell of rancid meat is because in the evolutionary history of humans, and actually pre-humans and pre-humans, those who ate rotten meat died, and those who found that to be repugnant survived and passed their genes on to us. I think that there is an analog here in the human habitat realm that we need to respect. I wrote in my first book about bees and beehives. And I think we recognize as the superior form of life. We can look at bees and we say, yes, we recognize bees live in beehives. But when we think about it and we look at them for any extended period of time, we recognize that bees create the hive, and the hive is perfectly formed to the bees. Bees are groupish the way we are groupish. They evolve in a groupish way. Bees don't evolve individually. They've actually evolved to be a coherent group. And their hives reflect not only their way of producing their food, their nutrients, but evolves to their entire social structure. We recognize that, and I was trying to think of who it was, if it was Mark Twain or Churchill or Lincoln or whatever, whoever famous quote, we shape the city, then the city shapes us. Is it Churchill, Joe? I can't remember who. We shape our buildings and our buildings. All right. If we go to the beehive, the bees shape the hive and the hive shape the bees, right? I also find that to be a little bit short, right? The bees and the hive evolved together to make the bees fully bee, right? Without a beehive formed in that way, the bees would not have the structure and the life that they have. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that bees would express a preference, whether we want to call that identify or recognize beauty or what have you, in the structure of the beehive itself. And in fact, I'll even take a step further and say, if we took a beehive and said, you know what, we could increase the production of honey if we just change this hive around a little bit and had a bee cul-de-sac over here, and we put a bee strip mall with honey production over here, and we had you live over here, and we'll have multiple queens. You would wind up with neurotic bees, right? I think we all understand that. If a higher life form comes and studies us, humans, I think that they will reach much of the same conclusions about our habitat. They will look at the way humans have built cities for thousands and thousands of years and recognize that there's a certain evolutionary kind of beauty to it, or what we would recognize as humans as beauty. This is our preference. This is our way of viewing things because we built it. Now, yes, there are going to be people on the edge. That's the way evolution works. There's always outliers. They take us in a different direction, and things shift and morph over time. But the reality that we build these places in this fractal way from the block up, and that they reflect us and our preferences, is not a stretch to me. To me, it is inherently what it means to be humans. Our city make us fully human. I think the interesting thing about this experiment that we're on, and at Strong Towns we call it the suburban experiment, this post-war experiment in building, is that we have tried to, in a sense, overlay a facade or a facsimile of beauty onto it. I think the primary critique of the new urbanism, for example, for people outside of it, is it's Stepford Wives, right? It's a fake reality. I think there's a lot more depth there, but if you simplify it down to just that, I get that critique. But the idea of suburbanization is it is a simplification of a complex system down to essentially one objective, that being economic growth. How do we stay out of the Great Depression? How do we, as the war is ending and as we're winding down all these industries of militarism, as we're demobilizing all these troops, how do we keep from going back to 1935? And the way we do that is we turn our cities into these machines of growth, these kinetic growth machines that can repeat and replicate themselves over and over and over and over. I think the aliens, when they came to visit and studied human history, would be very confused by this. Because I think much like we recognize we would have neurotic bees if we redid the beehive, I think of a lot of our cultural neuroticism today is directly related to the confusion that this development pattern creates for us. It's a deep honor to be here in Ion today, and I feel like what has been done here, obviously has a beauty to it that I think is very universal. It is a kind of marker in the ground saying we can build something like this if we intentionally want to do it. But I have to say that Charleston itself has always made me a little sad. And it makes me a little sad, not because it's not, I think probably the most beautiful handful of blocks in North America. I mean, I think it really is. But because of the recognition that we're looking at what is essentially a young boy or a young girl who has been stopped in their maturity. Someone who, when you look at them as a 8-year-old or 9-year-old, you're like, they're going to grow up to be a really amazing adult, but then they just stopped growing. That's what Charleston is. They just stopped. And you go to, Paris and you look and you're like, this is gorgeous. And then you come back to Charleston and you're like, this is gorgeous, but it's gorgeous in an adolescent kind of way, right? It never got to mature to its full potential. And along with that, it is surrounded by the worst of the suburban experiment, right? That itself also should be Charleston magnified. We should have miles and miles and miles of this stuff, not mere handful of a museum piece. And so I think in closing, the idea of beauty is one that we are going to have to reckon with again. I think this experiment that we are on is falling apart in many ways. And as as the city shapes us, as this new development pattern we run shapes who we are, I think we should be unafraid to assert, let me put it this way, because I don't want to get overly political here, but I think the relativism of beauty is in the eye of the beholder is just plain wrong. I think we can have different forms and different styles, but the idea that there is something that is intrinsically beautiful that emerges from thousands of years of experimentation and building a place, a form and a pattern that makes us fully human, is something that we should intrinsically recognize and not be afraid to stand up and say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, panelists, for your excellent presentations, and we're exactly where we wanted to be time-wise. We have about 35 minutes for questions from the, and just, Geoff, I think you were first.
All right. Thank you all. Thank you for being here. Chuck, am I understanding correctly from what you just said that we are still, our building pattern, you think, is still a product of war? Still a product of war?
We built this suburban experiment to stay out of the Great Depression, and now we use it to meet next quarter's GDP targets, right? The economy is faltering. What do? We need to invest in infrastructure. We need to grow the economy. We need to repeat this pattern over and over and over. And we're caught in this, in a sense, economic trap. And it drives the decisions that we would all like to see made. We would all like to see more housing. We would all like to see more equity. We would all like to see, there's a kind of a limitless number of things, but we're pushing against this machine that is essentially trying to fight against the Great Depression, right? Trying to continue this upward momentum of economic growth. And I think that's what we're struggling with today, is that system. And that system that ultimately, has an end date to it.
Yes, at this table here.
Whoa, loud, sorry. First of all, it's great, enjoying the panel. It's like watching my bookshelf talk, which is awesome. One of my questions about beauty is how we operationalize this. So it strikes me that what we end up with in a lot of US cities that are maybe attuned to the issue of beauty, we end up with design review commissions that arguably make buildings look worse. We end up with highly, highly prescriptive design rules that I agree, I think they're, we can say if something's rotten meat or, medium rare steak, but prescribing certain architectural styles. I'm just curious, in terms of operationalizing beauty in day-to-day planning, to hear some thoughts on that.
So I can tell you, as I've got lots of views on this, I'll tell you what we do in street votes. So here's one of the problems with beauty, right? Part of the problem of beauty is the individual property owner bears all of the cost of making a property beautiful, but the beauty of that building is a blessing to all the other buildings around it and to everyone who goes past. So it's like, in economic terms, paradigm case of a positive externality, and that means if you have fragmented property ownership and a free market, beauty may be underdelivered. Like, people think, okay, I'm going to, actually I'll put a multi-story car park here. Nobody cares whether a multi-story car park is beautiful or not, like in terms of whether they use it or not. So that's profit maximizing for my plot. It will destroy the value of all the plots around it because it's so ugly. I don't care, they're not my plots. Now, an interesting counterexample to that in English history, well, not a counterexample, but a related example, is the great estates in London. So these were big areas of West London which were, and in fact, to a large extent still are, owned by these single big aristocratic families. Because they owned all the properties in the area, the freeholds, they very carefully curated each property that they owned because they knew that if they built an ugly building on one plot, although it might be value maximizing for that plot, it would destroy the values of all the neighboring plots. And because they owned those plots, they really cared about them. So when you have unified ownership, you tend to get better behavior for that reason. Now, you can't replicate a great estate where it doesn't exist, and it's in many ways a good thing that we don't now live in a society where our cities are mainly owned by like a few dukes and stuff. But the thought we had with street votes is, could you create a sort of democratic replica of a great estate model. So so we require, when a street vote is held, the street plan that is voted upon has to contain a complete specification for the external appearance of the buildings. And the incentive that the street has, that the residents have, is to value maximize across the street as a whole rather than value maximize for each individual plot. And therefore, to quite a large extent, you should internalize the externalities that you would get if you just had a design free-for-all. I think that's the kind of, so that's obviously a very, very specific answer to your question, not a general answer. That is the kind of model I'd like to use in other cases. So as much as possible, empower ordinary people over these questions, not like committees of worthies who have all their own weird incentives to deal with, and like reputational incentives and these things. So ordinary people, but empower ordinary people in such a way that you're not just empowering each individual to do whatever they like, you are getting some of that kind of great estate effect replicated. That's like, not as like a quarter-baked answer to the question, but that, I think like that's the kind of model that could work in quite a lot of cases.
Elaine, did you want to follow up on that?
I would like to challenge the idea of Chuck that housing or cities shape people. I happen to have worked in countries who believe that very strongly, like Albania, China.
I don't believe that, by the way.
Well, that's what you say. Right?
Well, yeah, I said that. I think
it's
an oversimplification. I think that humans and their habitat evolved together.
Yes. But, well, not really. If you take, for instance, the Soviet city, there was a complete divorce between the population and the cities. I have also drawings from my Chinese colleague of an ideal socialist city in China. There was, they never quite implemented it. They tried, but it was precisely their goal was to use housing or to shape city. That means have collective, for instance, in Albania, separating children from their parents, saying, well, they will have a collective spirit hereafter. So I think it's you now say that this is not what you meant, so maybe I misunderstood. But I think that this idea, I think that if the city is maladapted to its population or housing maladapted to its population, I think it has a cost in terms of certainly happiness, maybe longevity even of the people, certainly productivity, but I don't think that people change. I think this is a Soviet idea that you can create a new people through changing their environment. This is a completely, this is the idea of the biologist, what was his name, wanted to change, Yes,
Yeah.
That's it. Sorry, I'm getting old, you said, I forgot that. So,
yeah, I mean, you can have Sparta and you can have, John Galt's libertarian utopia, I think in the same framework. You're getting into a kind of sociological human realm, and I don't know. I tend to think that historically these things evolve together over long periods of time. And I agree with you that any system that, in a sense, tries to fix the humans is going to struggle, right? It's going to struggle long term, right? Like we can make better humans by doing this,
But, the people shape the city or the habitat only if they are in a situation where they are in a Darwinian process. That means that each individual can have a slight variation over what his neighbor is doing, and eventually the better variation are freely adopted by these neighbors. This is not what we see now, where, again, I take the example of Sarah Hadid. I think she, the firm is a great architecture firm, but a terrible planner. And they are given an entire neighborhood to design, and this is very dangerous because then you kill entirely the Darwinian process.
Right. So, I'm sorry, Ellen. Nolan's question, I think, is fascinating. And I don't really know the answer specifically, but I have an analogy in my brain that keeps coming up. And it goes back to, it starts with music to me. If we look at music across different genres, different types of music, have certain threads to them in terms of time signatures and scales and chords. And you can experiment with dissonant chords, you can experiment with different things, but generally music across different cultures even tends to come back to very similar things. I feel like one of the reasons why I discovered the new urbanism or searched until I found it and said, wow, this is something that is meaningful, is to me, it is that basic rudimentary framework in which you can create jazz, you can create rap, you can create hip hop, you can create classical, you can create a whole bunch of different things off of a basic given framework. I feel like in regulation today, because we are regulating for growth, because we are regulating for a system that replicates itself over and over, it's like we're regulating the vocals and the guitar riff instead of the key signature and the tempo. And I think if we got back to, if we could somehow, and I'm in line with your book, if we could somehow scrap 90% of the codes we have, I would probably beef up the 10% then to really focus on things that I think create this framework where beauty can emerge from, and then free people up. I think people will build horrible developments, and I think they'll build beautiful developments. And I think over time, the beautiful developments will be the ones that would, in a sense, in a Darwinian sense, would win out in that. But I would rather have the ugly, the possibility of ending up with something ugly, because you have the possibility of ending up with something more beautiful than I could imagine, than have a design review committee tell me what beauty is.
I'm not sure if you're going to agree with this one, Chuck, but I'm going to kind of build on that to just say, I think rather than talking about this as if beauty is absolutely universal, I think there are traits, I think all of us interpret beauty very differently. We interpret what is a welcoming environment very differently. But I do think we are all driven to seek beauty. And that, on the one hand, it triggers growth, but it's part of why Apple products have been so successful. The country of Italy has figured, it's just sort of, I think their general education equips the general population to appreciate beauty in ways. So I do think we're all driven to seek it, and I agree. So I would agree with you that the more we can show it, the more we can educate folks about it. But sometimes just even getting it into the market, like Apple did. But I really would hesitate to. I think the minute you freeze it in a regulation, you've just killed it, and it dies.
Middle table. And then Andres.
With a natural level of attraction rather cheaply. So I'm from New York. You can think about Brownstone, Brooklyn. It was a suburban housing project, and those homes weren't built for very much. What do the panelists think about the notion of pre-approved pattern books almost as a way to, not to be prescriptive to say that every building must look like this, but that a certain amount for developers who might, or builders who might not have a strong design background but want to effectuate some good design, that it's already there. Is that too prescriptive? Thoughts?
So I'm sure it would work from like aesthetically perfectly possible. I mean, and it's not true that like we need loads of individual creativity. Like Georgia and London, the whole city is built out of basically one house type, scaled up to like 4 sizes for how rich the people were. Fine, like great. Why don't we just enforce those? And like everyone, if you want to build a row house in London, you've got to build one of those 4 house types from the 18th century. So like aesthetically fine. I was very interested in this idea at one time. I now think it's probably a non-starter politically, because I think we live in a society, I mean, as some my colleagues on the panel have said, like we live in a society where there is now more disagreement on aesthetic questions than there was in the 18th century, and there isn't the same sort of clear hierarchy of taste with one. So I think if maybe if you did this hyper-locally, it could work. Certainly if you do it street by street, it'd be okay. But if you're doing it locality by locality, maybe it would work. If you're doing it on a city level or a state level or a national level, I don't see it ever getting legitimacy nowadays.
Some people
So I'm a
have
bit skeptical.
morality police, others might want to have a beauty police.
It wouldn't be where I would put my energy. And maybe if I were building Ion, I would have a pattern book, right? But it would be for the first generation of this place, right? Like it needs to change over time. Yeah. I do think that what we have today is if you went back 100 years ago and you told someone, build a building that was going to maximize your own value and worth in a city, you would go out and build a building that lined up with your neighbors, fronted on the public realm, had a good interface between private space and public space, complemented your neighbor's property in a sense, because that was a cultural understanding in North America of how you build a place. And it just so happened that you acting in your own selfish self-interest would also have benefited everybody else. That's essentially the building form that we evolved here. If you went out today and said, build something now that's going to maximize your own selfish self-interest, well, you would put up, all kinds of barriers around your place. You would have a big obnoxious sign out front, a big parking lot, whatever it would be. It would be very antisocial. So I do think that there's a certain educational role for pattern books to play in people who, I want to do good, but I don't know what it looks like. We have lost the kind of cultural aptitude to build great places. This is why this place is so amazing. It's like, I remember when you first walked around with me, I said, you built this? This is, I'm like, wow, this just blows my mind. I think we've lost the cultural knowledge on how to do it. And so if we're using a pattern book in that way, great.
Andres?
For the most beautiful American cities, Annapolis, Savannah, Charleston, dozens of English and Connecticut villages. Thank you very much. I wish you'd stayed longer. I think the War of Independence was a terrific mistake. We could have ended up like Canada or Australia and been much less belligerent and probably happier. But too bad you left. Should have tried harder to stay.
We're very sorry.
The second thing is I am troubled by the word beauty, which I think is polemical, and I'd like to discuss aesthetics. But I would like to pick up again on Sam Hughes' very lightly positioned that if you show the right drawing, people like it. The beauty of the watercolor that they show. I said, well, if that's what it is. And I would like to position that I've always thought that aesthetics were camouflage. And what the new urbanists do, actually, is we use very conservative aesthetics to camouflage very radical programs. And our radical programs mean in a nation that is committed to large lots, automobiles very conveniently parked, complete lack of diversity, we're actually proposing systematically over and over and over again some of the most radical programs in the United States. I can repeat, diversity, mixed use, et cetera. Now, Ion, because because of its opposition, is not nearly as diverse as most new urbanist towns, which have townhouses that look highly compatible, and actually buildings the size that we have up there on the image could easily be in some of our other towns, sixplexes that nobody objects to because actually it's camouflaged. I often tell our renderers who think that they're actually doing architectural studies, I said, no, what you're doing is a drawing which is propaganda. Never forget that what you're doing is a propaganda poster, okay? It's not to please your professors at Harvard, you're confusing the natives. That's what you're doing, okay? And then I would like to say one last thing. I'm very disturbed by by the proposition that architecture cannot affect behavior. Perhaps I'm simplifying. One of the least noticed examples about Paris is that the increment of development was a relatively small apartment building with one stair and 8 or 12 apartments. And everybody knows that they're diverse, you know, that there are better and worse apartments, and some are dark and dingy that remain affordable, you know, usually in the courtyard, et cetera. So we know about the diversity, but we don't understand, what we don't remember is that the increment of development was so small that almost every middle-class family could develop a building. And they didn't need big developers. And so the diversity was right there, and they were all pre-permitted. Paris was pre-permitted. The Haussmann Code was extremely precise, and people could just get on with it. And the interesting thing about the increment of development was that if you developed one, you never had to work again. The income was such that you would house your family and have enough income to become a boulevardier, which is, as you know from Gigi, all you had to do was dress well and walk the boulevards and go to cafe. And that was a direct result of the increment of development. And it's something we misunderstand. We think that actually the Dallas Donuts, the big buildings that we're complaining about, that it's an aesthetic problem. It's actually a scale problem, and it's related to other aspects. So yes, I think aesthetics are camouflage, and it's easier if we refer to aesthetics. Now I'm going to say something that should be known. Many of the least radical programs, which are for the wealthiest of the wealthy, are acceptable to our radical architecture schools because they're camouflaged in avant-garde aesthetics. They actually reverse it. It's amazing. Like millionaires' houses, no problem with that. You know, apartments that sell for $7 million that wiggle up and down Manhattan, no problem with that. We show those in architecture schools, right? They have no problem because it's actually nostalgia for a revolutionary future that has never happened. And so the power of aesthetics is tremendous to actually affect camouflage. And we should actually continue doing it, but also learn from our modernist colleagues that get away with murder from doing the least diverse, most socially irresponsible projects on earth and are still accepted by the radical left socialists of architecture schools. So I admire them tremendously for that.
Please.
I want to double down on what Rich just said because I've heard and repeated and enjoyed the conventional, or I should say, conservative camouflage for radical ideas concept for many years, but this is the first time I realized that the corollary was also true, and that actually avant-garde, supposedly progressive imagery has been used tremendously to hide authoritarian and absolutely, conventional real estate. So that's fascinating. I'm sad, Chuck, that you're sad about Charleston. And I want to interrogate a little bit your feelings because, I'm sad about Charleston too, but for an entirely different reason, which I think is maybe more common, which is just to see what a kind of, simulacrum of itself it has become, that it's now enjoyed mostly by tourists and doesn't really feel so much like a real working city, and that so much of its economy is based on the wisdom of earlier inhabitants who preserved what was so great about it. And also I'm sad because there's so few of them, right? We can all name them, and what's sad is that it's rare. But I would challenge your idea that Charleston never grew up. I mean, I think there's different scales of intensity, of height, of density, of commerce, in cities, and Paris is one sort of scale, and New York is similar or more. But I think that as a model of a perfectly complete, mature city, I think Charleston and its cohorts are there. It's just a slightly easier style of life, right? And the idea, it's not Savannah, but it's it's not Charleston, but it's Savannah, the comparing of different cities, and John Berendt said, in Boston, they ask you where you went to school. In New York, they ask you what you do for a living. And in Savannah, they ask you, what are you drinking? And that people are happier, perhaps, in that third kind of city. And if you read Charles Montgomery's book, Happy City, he talks about how beyond a certain population and intensity, actually people are less happy because they feel more sense of competition from other people, and he calls it the hedonic treadmill, that everyone's always trying to become more important or more wealthy, whatever. So I just want to raise for discussion, perhaps, that your impression of Charleston being not mature, not complete, is based on perhaps admiring larger cities more than you need to because you come from Brainerd, Minnesota.
It's possible. I would like to, we will never get this chance, but imagine if we had had 75 years of continuing to mature the Charleston pattern instead of essentially freezing it, making it into a museum piece, and then surrounding it with what we've surrounded it with. That's what makes me sad, because I don't know. Maybe it would look very much like it is now, just surrounded by acres and acres of similar type of building, which would be amazing, which would be astounding, which would be a great place to live. But it wouldn't, it wouldn't look like it does today.
Charleston is a case of arrested development.
Arrested development, yeah,
but
that's.
There's a reason for that.
You need to use the microphone.
The government of the United States between 1861 and 1865 devastated this city. They tried to destroy all the churches. Huge parts of it were burned. And afterwards, it was subject to an economic subjugation, which to me, it's incredible that so much of the city did survive. I mean, I'm very proud to have been brought up in Charleston. I wasn't born here. But when you consider that the vast power of an industrial state was used to destroy this place, it's sort of the Dresden of the United States, I wouldn't be too hard on the arrested development.
Andrew.
I'm gonna.
Jason.
I'm gonna just quickly. Ellen, you had brought something up in the beginning, talking about your catalog of former strip malls, and one of the things that I think is interesting about Charleston is, as my generation has gotten priced out of the peninsula, we're all forced to move into these suburbs that are kind of gross, kind of monotonous, kind of run down, and we're in many ways putting beauty into them, or back into them. It's kind of the suburban Jane Jacobs model of taking something that's kind of dead and bringing it back to life. And a lot of the strip malls, when I was in college 15 years ago, that were dead, are being brought back to life in a way that's kind of quirky, kitschy, but looks exactly the same. They're not redeveloping them. They're not tearing them down and starting over. They might put some infill buildings in, but they're generally just repurposing them. And I'm curious if that's what you're seeing elsewhere in suburbia in the United States, if it's a reprocessing or purposing of the structure for new uses or a total redevelopment.
Absolutely, I am. And so I tried to, I know I kind of glossed over, when people talk about retrofitting suburbia, most of the time, they're interested in the redevelopments, but I actually tried to define it, even at the start of my comments today. Yes, in very strong markets. I mean, that is off what is happening. But in softer markets, and often with just smaller sized parcels, it makes much more sense to save that embodied carbon, save that existing building, and put in some small local new businesses coming in. The re-inhabitation of former suburban buildings, there are just hundreds and hundreds of really phenomenal examples, and absolutely that is happening.
Dr. Timothy, in your book, The Ethics of Beauty, you remind us that the West has kind of forgotten how to correctly order the transcendentals, that it's common in the West to speak of truth, goodness, and beauty, truth being first. But that according to Greek philosophy, originally, it was the other way around. It was beauty, goodness, truth. Beauty is the thing that everyone can recognize with their own eye as goodness, morality naturally follows from the study of beauty, and that only after that does the discernment of truth emerge. And I think we can see this incorrect ordering in city planning. We can see in the 20th century a number of strategies of sort of truth-first planning of society, planning cities around the latest scientific ideas of health or eugenics or of traffic patterns, a sort of statistical-based city planning. And I think nowadays in America, we're starting to see sort of a morality-first approach of city planning, the goodness first, where it's about theories of green environmentalism, or it's about theories of freedom, or it's about theories of social justice and restitution for race injustice and so forth, should be the new model for how we plan cities. But of course, in all of these discussions, everyone always neglects beauty in these Western discussions, when beauty really should be first. And we've heard from the panel some critiques of why it's problematic to put beauty first, in the sense of having a board of architecture review that tries to legislate beauty. Indeed, I know firsthand that doesn't work very well. I'm curious if you, through your discussions with Jane Jacobs, have any insights into how do you put beauty first in urban planning?
I don't know. One of the comments that Jacobs made was that nothing was uglier than the mask of an imposed false order pressed over and preventing the real order that was struggling to exist and be served. So for her, first of all, it's that possibility of human agency that has to be invested in as the first step to a beautiful neighborhood, that people are ethically agents and they have the education and the access to financial capital and all the rest of it to create their neighborhoods from below. She said in another book, in the Cities and the Wealth of Nations, she said that people like you, who are the guardians and caretakers of complex living systems, that when you don't know what to do next, then you have to rely on an aesthetic drift. You have to experiment with what seems beautiful to you and kind of follow your hunch without concern immediately for its practicality. And to me, that is why I would claim Jane Jacobs' blessing for new urbanism, although in reality, she wasn't concerned about suburbs. Because it is the place where, in trying to do something beautiful, we're relearning how to make cities beautiful. I don't know what else. And finally, this thing about statistics, right? Crucial, even in The Death and Life of Great American Cities, is this beautiful passage where she says, real people are nothing like statistical people. Statistical people are interchangeable. You can throw them anywhere. She said this only applies in America to junior executives, junior army officers, and hippies. That was her. But she says real people invest years of their lives in significant relationships, and torn from those relationships, they cease functioning. So that is the ugliness of a statistical approach in that sense of statistics, at any rate. That's not a good answer, but there's some thoughts. But you have, please.
So it looks like there's a little problem in the discussion. You have to consider the following, that people think in terms of symmetric relationship, beautiful, not beautiful. It's what is qualitatively different. It's very difficult to define beauty, but you can for sure define ugliness, and you remove what's ugly. So we know, I don't think that many human beings equipped with a brain and eyes and whatever, and ability to express themselves would find Newark, New Jersey more beautiful than this town, okay? On the other hand, some people would like Savannah better, some people would like Florence better, some people like myself would prefer this town.
Thank you. Ellen?
That is the via negativa. That's the, given that we're in an Orthodox structure and we have Orthodox theologian, it's a via negativa. That's very difficult to define God by the positive, what God is. It's extremely easy to define God by the negative, what God is not. So it's the same thing for beauty. And once you use that approach, you know what to ban, but not what to encourage. It's not the job of the community to decide how your house should look like, but it's perhaps the right to veto something that can look semi-objectively ugly.
I want to bring up a reference and encourage folks to look it up. Elijah Anderson is a black sociologist at Yale who has written quite a bit about black space and white space. And I think he'd actually even disagree with your comparison of Newark, New Jersey, to Ion. What he would argue is that since the Civil War, African Americans have had to negotiate spaces primarily designed for whites, and where they are often feeling surveyed, questioning how do I feel like I belong, often knowing that they stand out as a minority, reinforcing their minority status, and that whites rarely have to negotiate black space because of the majority and minority. And this is, so let me add a second piece to this. 3 weeks ago, I was toured by an African-American alum of Georgia Tech through Atlanta has 8 gated black communities where homes start over $1 million. He knows that I hate gated communities, don't like McMansions, but what's fascinating is how absolutely identical the McMansions in the black gated communities look to the white communities. It is not that the actual taste preferences, the actual what they believe is, what is believed is beautiful is different between the whites and the blacks in those gated communities. But that feeling of belonging and the user's actual experience of being in a different space is very, very different. And it's a critical, it's a sort of fine-grained difference, but it's really, I think, important to trying to understand what it means as we become, frankly, a majority-minority country.
Sonia? Oh, please. And then
yeah, sorry. Thank you for taking the question. This is actually really for you, Tim. At the beginning, you talked about healthfulness as a, maybe not synonym for beauty, but maybe a way to understand beauty. And I think about, okay, we've talked a lot about aesthetic, like literally visual beauty, but we have other senses. So taste is a great one. My generation cares a lot about restaurants. Many of you know Tyler Cowan, who works with me at Mercatus, and one of his tips on finding good food is you go to the ugliest buildings and you avoid places with beautiful people in them. And so literally there's this substitution away from aesthetic beauty to get, and he's not saying that they're not beautiful people, they're not beautiful buildings, he's just saying a ranky old strip mall is more likely to have really, really good South Indian food. How do we approach it? Maybe this is just way too open-ended, but how do we approach this sort of multi-dimensional, because I think a place where immigrant entrepreneurs are founding really interesting restaurants is deeply healthy and beautiful in a way that it's actually very illegible, right? You actually have to eat a number of meals at a restaurant before you're like, oh, this is a great restaurant that I'm gonna recommend to my friends. How do we deal with finding health and beauty that we can't just see?
I mean, that's a good question, but generally, I mean, just like the ancient Greeks thought of the city as a body, that they described that, the interrelation of the parts. For Jacobs, the city is a kind of an animal, and it's something like that. National economies are for her a fiction. There are various cities, and those are life forms that are not served by having a unified currency for a nation, that are not served, whatever. But it's the same with at the level of where to find restaurants. This thing has a kind of feeling dimension. Especially when things go wrong. I always think about Cesar Millan, the dog whisperer. If the dog is really out of control, take it down to its animal level, then treat it as a dog, then as breed. And if you have to, how does this place make you feel? I don't feel safe if it's all picture windows. I don't want the windows. I don't want to walk under that at some deep level. So. But yeah, you do have to learn a sophisticated sense of beauty in a city, and that's the great thing about it. Things that shocked you, or your aesthetic sense should be getting more sophisticated just by living in a city, and of course it does. Yeah.
Say one thing about beauty. I mean, I think sometimes there's this very vexed debate about objectivity and subjectivity of beauty, and people think, we can only recognize beauty as a relevant consideration in urban design and planning, and so if it's like objective in some really strong sense, and like we can clearly identify this as a thing which all rational people are agreed about, and anyone who doesn't agree about this is failing to see something which is there in the world. But I think this is maybe slightly mistaken. So suppose, like, smell. So smell probably is, like, nice smells, unpleasant smells, very plausibly that is a subjective thing. Like, some people like some smells, some people don't like some smells, they can't argue about that. No one's being irrational, it's just a difference in how your nose is constituted. So it's subjective, eye of nose of the beholder. Does that mean that public authorities have no responsibility to stop smells that almost everyone finds extremely foul from pouring into public spaces? That, like, public authorities shouldn't be worried about the smell of sewage or something being wafting about the streets. No, like, it can be subjective but still matter. If it displeases a very large number of people, then we've got perfectly good reasons not to have it. If it pleases a very large number, so like lots of these things.
Can I add two quick things on that, just to tie in with what? No, keep your mic on, because I'm just gonna say, smell also has a cultural component to it, and it also has a getting used to it component to it. I know many farmers who like the smell of manure on a field, and it signals something to them in a way that it wouldn't for people in other places. So I think when Nassim is bringing up New Jersey, and my experience in New Jersey was being in the Army. And it was not I don't have a lot of pleasant mental images of what New Jersey looks like. A lot of interchanges and a lot of, yeah. But, I think that there is a cultural component to it, and there is a certain, this is what I'm used to, and I love it, and don't take that from me component to it that I think we should recognize in beauty as well, right?
Yeah, I think so. We don't have to be, but we can be quite metaphysically modest about beauty and still think it matters. And we have to be prepared for people's decisions about beauty to be thrashed out at the level of democratic, ideally local debate, or, in some cases, to be thrashed out it can't be simply thrashed out at the level of the market because of some of the issues that I raised before. But in some, when people talk about their interiors, if you like this, go ahead. I mean, it's great for you to be able to have this in your interior. I don't have to like it. So I think, like, sometimes people get too caught into like a confrontational debate about the metaphysics of beauty, which we don't necessarily need to have in order to recognize its importance when we talk about these issues in how we shape our private and our shared homes.
Sonia?
Yeah, I have kind of the same point. A few years ago, a funny study went around where they asked, like, what do you think was the greatest time in American history? And the answer was when the respondent was 30 years old. And that kind of, in my personal life, I feel like when I talk to people and I find out about what they think is like beautiful or great for a neighborhood, it's the place they lived in their life when they were the happiest. So a lot of times it's in your 20s, could be another part of your life. Maybe it's your childhood. So it's very subjective. It depends so much on what you're used to. I feel like we're like ducks, we get imprinted with the place that we were when we were happy. So I feel like it's a fool's errand to chase after beauty. I mean, one thing you can do though is I think in general, most of the time, if there's a nice tree canopy, people are happy, and you can't see the buildings anyway when there's a lot of trees. And so you can be very free. But
it's going to take a while for those, but we do have a mechanism, right? If you can build in a levy into it so that some of the value uplift is captured not just by individual residents, but by either the local authority or by a street council, which can then invest in public spaces. So yes, I mean, Well, so actually, I think I can literally back myself in saying, given 20 years, you really could have that change from that street to that street, and it would be perfectly economically viable, and it's really something people could opt into. Like, yes, it's propaganda, but it's not lying. So I would say that, obviously, but
Yes.
So I'd like to just change gears a little bit on the beauty. We've talked about aesthetics, buildings, and so forth. I'd like to ask the panel about the structure of cities, the street network, the open space system. Someone once told me that a lot of the value of Savannah comes from its block structure and its relationships that it's created, even though it's on its 4th generation of buildings. So I'd like to ask you about the structure and that contribution to beauty. Thanks.
Words, fine grain. Fine-grained blocks, the fine-grained ecosystems, the fine-grained detailing of building materials, just I think that is, and the fine-grained modes of mobility, rewarding the pedestrian eye. Those are all just so fundamental.
yeah, I mean, it's tricky to get like hard evidence on beauty. Like you can poll people, and that does produce some quite interesting results, and there are overlaps. But we've got lots of hard evidence on the relationship between urban form and like health, well-being, prosperity, sustainability, and street networks. Like that's one of the ones where evidence is clearest, and like there's a huge body of scholarly literature that's built up on that. So I mean, everyone here will know this stuff better than I will, but like the stuff on fineness of grain, the stuff on the numerousness of interconnections. One of the things that's really tough about street networks is how hard they are to change once they're there. So that is something where, like, I mean, I was looking out of the window of the plane coming into Charleston on Saturday, and like the final part of that coming to Charleston is intensely beautiful, very. Before that, I was looking out over all the subdivisions that we've been talking about, and I was thinking, wow, okay, this is going to be a problem for street votes because you can't vote a different street network. Like, it's not clear how exactly it would work. That's one of the things we kind of hardwire into our urban landscape. So that I don't have an easy answer to that. That's something I worry about and keeps me up at night.
Ian, as an engineer, I'm burdened with thinking of the city this way instead of the architect way. So when I'm speaking, I'm thinking of it in that way. I don't know if you've read Ann Sussman, Justin Hollander's book, The Cognitive Architecture, but I have found so much depth and brilliance in that little book, despite the quirkiness of the two of them and their approach. I think there's some deep nuggets there of insight. For example, they have a whole section on thigmotaxis, the idea that living organisms like edge conditions and prefer them as almost an evolutionary security type of thing. And that we feel most comfortable in spaces that are bound than spaces that are wide open. Think of walking down a street with a boundary condition on the side as opposed to walking across a Walmart parking lot. In one, we feel naked and vulnerable. In the other one, we feel somewhat secure or more secure. To me, when I think of a city, and I think this idea of being shaped by the city or the city shaping us and that interplay is something I want to explore. As I think about it, to me, the baseline is that there's a certain, when we look at human habitat of the past and we recognize its emergent nature, what we see is that people built spaces that calmed their nerves, made them feel comfortable, made them feel, and I'm kind of equating all that to beauty. The building terminating the street might have been modest, and we might not look at it and think it was much, but it was the best that they could build, and they built it that way. Having the cemetery where they buried their dead over here where they could access it and pay homage to people might not have been aesthetically beautiful the way we think of aesthetics, but it might have been beauty in terms of their feeling of that place and their sense of belonging and their sense of this community. I feel like all those are essential to beauty in the way that I think about it. And to me, it signals that we can do a lot of things that are really amazing, beyond just the architecture and beyond just the things that I think a design review committee would bring to the table. There's so many other tools in this toolbox to create great human habitat that I think we just casually ignore.
Well, I think that if I look at pattern of, to answer your question, the pattern of cities around the world, I see many very viable solutions which are extremely different. For instance, here there have been let's say, a rejection of cul-de-sac. Cul-de-sac is considered to be not very good. Now, maybe in the American context, American suburb, this is true. One of the most pleasant walking environment is the center of Cairo, old city of Cairo, Gamaliel, which is full of cul-de-sac. And it's precisely the cul-de-sac, but with relatively small street, which reach to Main Street, where the commerce are, which make it pleasant. Now, again, there is a cultural aspect here. I'm not sure that somebody who is used to live in Houston will be happy living in Gamaliel, and vice versa. When I was a kid in Marseille, we had a geography book, and there was a map of Manhattan. And all of us thought, oh my God, those people must lose their way all the time because there are only two types of streets, there are the streets and the avenue. How do they recognize them? And then when we learned that on top of it, there was a number for street and a number of avenue, that was even worse. We say, how do you remember Fifth Avenue from 6th compared to, Joan of Arc Avenue or Emile Zola Avenue? This was. So you see, there is a cultural aspect here. We really thought that people in Manhattan will get lost all the time.
So, yes, is that Vince?
So, you may recall in Death and Life of Great American Cities, Jacobs had this kind of list of things that you needed for beauty, one of which was small blocks or short blocks. And it gets to Ellen's point and some others made about the importance of grain, fine grain. And I think in terms of beauty, sometimes in terms of opportunity. And this, one of my favorite quotes about cities is from a ancient Greek poet, Alcaeus of Mytilene, who said, "Not houses finely roofed, not the stones of walls well built, nor canals nor dockyards make the city, but men able to use their opportunity." And if y'all have seen it now, walking around the Ion, I think one of the things that was beautiful to me being involved in this with others is that, yeah, we built some of the streets and shaped them and built the sidewalks and planted street trees, but we engaged all these different people who were throwing their hearts into it. And we weren't building any of the buildings, we just had the public realm. But this opportunity was there that was created. I think oftentimes we weren't developing a neighborhood so much as we were developing opportunities for others to come in, and they responded. So just want to open that up to the panel about that. And Tim, maybe you especially, but all of y'all are familiar with Jacobs and her focus on that aspect of the science of complexity, and this emergence that happens.
Yeah, yes, anyone on the panel want to address that aspect of opportunity and seizing opportunity in cities as part of its beauty?
I feel like there's a line here, Vince, between beauty and love, right? That is very squishy, right? We tend to find beauty in the things we love, and when we create places of opportunity, they become beautiful. I think a lot of you, if you visited my hometown, would not find it very beautiful, aesthetically speaking, unless you like Taco John's and the ambiance of Mills Fleet Farm. But I love it. I find it beautiful, and I find it beautiful largely because of other things. My family's been there over 120 years now. I have a lot of memories of the place. I have now raising children there. So beauty, I think, and love, in the best sense, go together. And they go together in a way that an engineer is not prepared to describe very well, but a poet might be. And I think the way you talk about opportunity captures a lot of that.
If I could jump on that, you know, for Jacob, she thought there was something new in this new science, that in studying complex systems, if you didn't first love them, you would never understand them. And she thought that didn't apply to the other two sciences as sciences. So this was not a religious statement, it was just her belief scientifically. She didn't substantiate that, but she did give the example. She said all the people that have been ruining our cities frankly admitted that they hated cities. And so what did we expect? And one of the reasons we want to beautify our cities in a way that makes sense for us culturally is so that other people, our fellow citizens, will love this city and will be motivated to stand up and make the sacrifice, and motivated to realize their potential, because that's beautiful too.
Yeah. We do, I'm sure. I would only add, I think, Vince, that by providing opportunities for others, part of what is such a great gift of that is how you are, it's really seeing beauty in terms of life, that it is this ongoing, evolving. We've seen the words evolution and evolving kind of throughout this discussion, and that I think that just connecting beauty to as living systems and cities as living systems. Part of the problem with suburbia is that we've always assumed that our city, culturally, we've always assumed that our downtowns, our cities are dynamic, we expect them to change, and the suburbs have been the other and expected to remain frozen in amber in whatever form they were first given birth in, and it's time to let them grow up.
That's up to you and Vince.
Just
Please.
a quick question. In terms of structure, we know that in designing the city beautiful, there were things that were in the city and some things that were excluded. And then we had exurban areas where a lot of our natural environment was allowed to thrive. So as we look forward, and Ellen, you were mentioning, when we get to a multicultural future, how does that city look different to you?
To me, part of what I think I'm hope that it will allow us to do is actually talk about beauty in a more human constructed way than focusing on the differences between different minority, majority, racial, ethnic groups. That's one aspect that I would hope we is actually able to come out of becoming a much more multicultural. It's interesting, I mean, right now we can look at places like Quebec, Canada, and certainly see how it's more a system of coexistence, but I would hope we can actually perhaps use beauty and the complexity, in all its complexity, to really bring us beyond simply coexistence. You think too.